which will be done by Anneke Derived. You can see the title of the talk at this slide. And I will just briefly read a few information about Anneke. So Anneke is an assistant professor in open data at the Delft University of Technology in the Netherlands. Her research is focused on the development of theory that explains how, why, and when infrastructural and institutional arrangements can incentivize open data sharing and use behavior by governments, researchers, companies, and citizens. During her PhD, Anneke developed a theory for the development of open government data infrastructures, which she also transformed into advice for open data policymakers. Several elements of her theory have been implemented in the international projects, including FP7 Project Engage and Horizon Project VRE for EAC. Anneke obtained her PhD with distinction, only awarded to the top 5% of Technical University of Delft PhD candidates. In 2016, she received the International Digital Governance Junior Scholar Award, and she was ranked as one of the most influential open data researchers worldwide. The importance of her research was also emphasized through Best Paper awards she received at important conferences in her field of information science. Okay, I'm not going to read the brief abstract of this presentation because I'm quite sure that Anneke will do that better and better explain what is the main goal of her presentation. So Anneke, you have 45 minutes for your complete presentation. Thank you very much for accepting to be with us today. And please leave some time for questions as well.
Yes, thank you, Dragan. I'll share my screen. Yes. Okay, so you should be able to see the slides now. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this presentation. Dragan, thank you very much for the kind introduction. So today I would like to discuss with you about open research data sharing and use. I will address infrastructural and institutional arrangements, like Dragan said, and those can be used to encourage researchers to share and use open research data. And I will also discuss some of the challenges along the way. But before we dive into the content, let's think about a practical situation in which data sharing might take place. So imagine you're a PhD researcher and you're working at Faculty of Social and Behavioral Sciences in some imaginary university somewhere in Europe. And you carried out a study about how people interact with each other. And you're considering to openly share the data that you collected in this study because you're actually quite convinced that sharing the data openly could be beneficial to other researchers. And at the same time, your university does not actively support you with data sharing, does not acknowledge you for this. You don't have much time to share the data. There's no institutional support. For instance, no data, research data management support for advisors, no institutional policy on data sharing, maybe no repository where you could deposit the data, and no support from your supervisors and colleagues. So we'll now have a short poll, and I will ask you the question, in this particular situation, would you openly share your research data? So you can click on either yes or no, and then we can have a look at the results. Okay, so we have a few seconds for this. Yeah, so it would be interesting to have a look at the results. Yeah, and you should be able to see the results now. So you see 59% of everyone who voted said they would not openly share their research data in this particular situation, and 41% would still do it. Okay, so before I discuss this more in depth, let's go to another imaginary situation. Oops. So consider the same situation, but in this situation, so you're still a PhD student, you're still you still did that study on how people interact with each other, and now you, in this situation, you receive a lot of support from your institution for openly sharing your data. There will be a repository where you can easily deposit your data. Your supervisor and colleagues encourage you to openly share your data, and your faculty also has a dedicated data steward who can help you with cleaning up the data set, removing personal data from it, putting it in the right format. Again, same question. Would you share your data in this situation? So think about it. You can vote again. And in a few seconds, we could have a look at the results. Yeah. Wow, 96% says, yes, I would share in this situation. 4% says, no, I would not. So that's quite a big difference compared to the previous vote, where we saw 59% of everyone who was willing to share. So this situation with a lot of support indeed increases the willingness of researchers and the ability of researchers to openly share their data, as you're showing here. So one more question to you. Let's go to the third imaginary situation. So would this situation be different if you would have collected data that would be related to the COVID-19 crisis? So your research on interactions between how people socially interact and maybe also distance from each other, that might be useful to researchers who advise, for instance, governmental policymakers concerning COVID-19 measures. Again, the same question, would you openly share your data in this situation? So you can vote again. And we take some time for you to vote. So let's have a look at the results. Yeah, 89% now says I would openly share my data in this situation. Oh, that's actually a bit surprising to me, because the number is slightly lower than in the previous situation, where we had the same situation with a lot of support, but then the data was not COVID-19 related. Well, I'll come back to this later in my presentation, where we also discuss data sharing in relation to COVID-19. So in these imaginary situations, a researcher may or may not openly share his or her research data. And they give you an illustration of various infrastructural and institutional arrangements that can stimulate researchers or discourage researchers to share their data. And such arrangements can be, for instance, policies of universities or the availability of data repositories. I'll come back to this later in the presentation, but first I would like to discuss with you a study I'm currently conducting on open research data, and in which I'm examining the relationship between the complex and integrated factors that influence research data sharing. And we did so using a questionnaire. So the questionnaire is still open, but I'm excited to share some preliminary findings with you. Yeah, so let me first share some information on the research approach. So we are very grateful that already 119 respondents completed the questionnaire. We largely disseminated it across a lot of different research disciplines. The majority of the respondents so far is between 31 and 40 years old, namely 34%, and 28% is between 21 and 30 years old. Slightly more women than men were involved. And these 119 respondents come from 33 different countries. We had 1 to 3 respondents from most of the countries, and about a third of the respondents comes from the Netherlands, namely 35%. Out of the respondents who are researchers, nearly 3/4 are academic researchers, 71%, while 12% concerns academic researchers. So the findings that I'm going to report now, they are based on the responses of the 99 respondents who stated that they are researchers. Majority of the respondents who provided information about their current position are PhD candidates and associate assistant and full professors. Experience with practicing open science principles and open research data was very diverse. So it ranged from no experience at all to considerable experience. And 41 out of 99 respondents have openly shared research data in the past few months. There's a large diversity between the research disciplines that the respondents are working in. For instance, political science, psychology, medicine, economics, biology, computer science, philosophy, public administration, and many others. And then 25 out of 99 respondents stated that their research discipline was COVID-19 related. In general, these respondents were very positive about openly sharing research data. We saw that 88 out of 99 respondents stated that it would be good if they would openly share their research data themselves. And 78 said that other people in their environment would actually be positive if, would approve it if they would openly share their data. At the same time, 34 out of 99 respondents are encouraged by their supervisor and 35 by their colleagues to openly share research data. And only 35 were convinced that most people like them, so in a position as a researcher, openly share research data through a data repository. So that's indicating that these researchers believe that a lot of other researchers in their environment were not openly sharing research data. In the imaginary situations that I discussed at the beginning of the presentation, I asked you whether your willingness to share research data openly would change if your research will be COVID-19 related. Actually, we saw that the willingness was lower, which is a bit different from the findings from our survey. So that's interesting. In our research, we found out that out of the 99 respondents, 62 stated that the COVID-19 crisis did not influence their willingness to openly share research data. But yeah, over 1/3 of the respondents, namely 38%, said that the COVID-19 crisis did increase their willingness to openly share research data. And that was either to a small, a medium, or a large extent. So this is an interesting finding, and it suggests that a crisis like COVID-19 can make researchers more aware of the advantages of openly sharing research data. Although one should note the low numbers of respondents involved in the survey, of course. So the findings may have to do with respondents' research disciplines. So we examined this and whether this research discipline is COVID-19 related. But we do not really see any obvious differences between the chances in, between the willingness to openly share research data. So they cannot really be explained by either working in social sciences and humanities or other research disciplines. Now, one may have expected that the increased willingness to openly share research data would mainly be found in COVID-19 related research disciplines, and that the lack in change of willingness would be found in non-COVID-19 related research disciplines. So in that case, you would expect that the numbers in the upper left cell and the lower right cell here would be significantly higher than the other ones. But this was also not the case. So we're still investigating whether other factors might explain the increase in willingness of the 38% of the respondents who said that that the COVID-19 crisis has increased their willingness to openly share their data. But do note that these results should be treated with caution since the numbers per cell are relatively low and we do need to collect more responses. So I'm very grateful to all the respondents who have already participated in this study. And since this study is still ongoing, I hope you also consider answering the questionnaire if you're a researcher, and perhaps distributing the questionnaire in your network. So here you see the link to the questionnaire, and I will also paste it in the chat after this presentation. Of course, we will also share the final outcomes of the study as open research data, and you can leave your email address in the questionnaire if you want to receive a summary of the findings later this year. Thank you for your consideration. Let's go to the next part of my presentation, which concerns infrastructural and institutional arrangements. So in the imaginary situations that we discussed before, I refer to a researcher who was willing to openly share his or her research data, but may not have shared openly because there was a lack of infrastructural and institutional arrangements. So the questionnaire also provided the insight that researchers currently receive limited infrastructural and institutional support for openly sharing research data, because the majority of the respondents disagree with the statements that you can see here, namely that they have sufficient institutional and infrastructural support to openly share their research data. At the same time, previous research suggests that the negative impact of many challenges around openly sharing and using research data can be reduced with the right infrastructural and institutional arrangements. So what exactly are those arrangements? Let's have a look at that. In previous research, infrastructural arrangements have been defined as a combination of open data portals or platforms that support research data sharing and use in different research disciplines, like you can see here in transport or energy or justice or environmental sciences. Metadata standards and formats and data standards and formats. It also concerns the tools for processing, searching, analyzing, and visualizing data, the mechanisms to enhance privacy, computing infrastructures, data infrastructures, and other technical elements. So now we defined infrastructural arrangements. How can we define institutional arrangements? According to the literature, institutional arrangements can be defined as formal structures, such as university policies and processes, informal structures, such as norms and culture, and enforcement characteristics or operational mechanisms that institutions need to have in place to incentivize research data sharing and use. And also governance elements, for example, mechanisms to enhance privacy and trust, as well as the interaction with other data providers and users. Institutional arrangements, they can be hierarchy-based, so that refers to authority and rules. They can also be market-based when they are focused on competition, exchange, and interaction between actors. And they can also be network-based. So then there's a focus on cooperation between actors, trust, mutual dependencies, and actor responsibilities. So these are arrangements that are mentioned in the literature, and I was actually interested in which arrangements can be found in practice and how they affect research data sharing and use. So together with honor student Tijmen van Gent, we started a study at our own university, TU Delft in Netherlands. Here's our approach. We studied the TU Delft policy documents, such as university-wide and faculty-specific research data management policies, the open science policy of TU Delft. We also had a look at the research data management information that was presented on the university website and the support arrangements that are currently in place. And after that, Tijmen carried out 7 interviews so far to see how these arrangements work in practice. So there were 4 interviews with policymakers, 3 with open research data service providers and support providers, 1 with a researcher actively engaged in sharing data, and 2 with researchers less actively engaged in data sharing. Some interviewees had multiple roles, so these numbers do not count up to 7. Um, we first aim to create a comprehensive overview of all infrastructural arrangements that we could identify in our university. So let me give you an overview of the arrangements that we identified in these three categories: discovering the infrastructure, selecting an infrastructure, and the institutional ForTU data repository that's actually used at TU Delft. So in the category of discovering the infrastructure, researchers are looking for infrastructural arrangements that support them to upload and download their data. In interviews, it was stated that researchers usually use the first repository they find. That seems to work well. They upload their data and they usually do not look further if it works well. Furthermore, with regard to downloading data, researchers are often struggling with finding suitable data and data repositories for especially their field research. We found that it is not always easy to select an institutional, disciplinary, or generic research data repository. So TU Delft has data stewards working within each of the 8 university faculties. And they also do not always have clear guidelines for how to find the appropriate repository to openly share a specific research data set, because this is very complicated. The ForTU data repository is a repository offered by 4 universities in the Netherlands, including TU Delft. And this repository is sometimes perceived as the institutional repository because of TU Delft's affiliation with it. But actually it is a broad disciplinary repository. So according to the policymakers that we spoke to, this repository should be considered a pretty good alternative in case that no suitable domain-specific repository is available. But in our study, we found that many researchers simply opt for the ForTU repository because it is seen as the official repository. Yeah, and then the TU Delft library offers both front and back office support, which is greatly appreciated by researchers. And this is partly due to the metadata and privacy checks that are performed. The downside of this is that publishing data in the ForTU repository is relatively slow, as the service providers of the ForTU data repository first need to approve the data uploads. Although this usually doesn't take very long, but compared to node checks, it takes a little longer. After creating an overview of infrastructural arrangements, we created an overview of institutional arrangements at TU Delft. We identified institutional arrangements in the categories of institutional policies, data management education, community support, research data management support, financial support, and guidelines. TU Delft has a university-wide framework of faculty-specific policies in place, which allows for taking account of domain-specific requirements. So our preliminary findings suggest that these institutional policies barely influence data sharing and use practices, as not everyone knows about them, reads them, and they are perceived as yet another administrative or regulatory burden. The policy designers are aware of this, as what we found in our interviews, and they do not intend to use the policy as a coercive instrument. Then with regard to the category of education in the institutional support, our study shows that TU Delft uses various types of education to support researchers in openly sharing and in using open research data. So for example, a massive open online course on open science has been developed, in which I was also involved. And as another example, the university library offers workshops about software carpentry, data carpentry, and code refinery. These are very popular workshops, and there's just a limited number of available places. This is also the reason why they're launching a central research data management course soon. And with this new course, new PhD researchers or other interested researchers can be educated on both research data management and the infrastructural and institutional arrangements that are in place. With regard to community support, researchers with an affinity for data sharing who want to help others with research data management matters, or who want to learn from other researchers who are experienced with data sharing use, can join the Open Science Community Delft. So this community does not seem to have a significant influence on researchers' willingness to openly share research data, as not many researchers are familiar with who actually participates in this community and what are the activities they are doing, and that they can approach people active in the community for questions about research data sharing, which is a pity because it's a nice group of people who are very motivated to work on research data sharing and to teach others about this as well. But it's not necessarily a bad thing, as people in the community can still learn from each other. And the lack of demand could also mean that researchers instead consult the data steward of their faculty. Data management plans, they may be required, for instance, by funders, by department heads, or by ethics committees. And they force researchers to think about data sharing and reuse. So it does influence their workflow. However, data management plans are mostly only completed because of an obligation. So they do not reach the researchers who are not affected by such obligations. So in addition to this first type of research data management support, each faculty of TU Delft has its own dedicated data steward, who is officially the first contact point for any data-related query. He or she is also the person to approve the data management plan. So that means that every researcher who completes such a plan knows about the existence of the data steward, and that the steward can be accessed for questions. And the faculty data stewards improve data sharing and reusing practices, as they can motivate people who were previously not interested in data sharing, and they can support them once they've overcome some initial barriers. For instance, when they've completed their first data management plan. And then a third, so a third research data management support arrangement that we found in our study is the employment of data managers by the university. So they can be hired by research groups. They can take care of data management concerns in research projects. It can be funded by the library of the university or by a project funded from an external source, such as the European Commission. But the impact of the data managers is not yet known because they're not in place yet. So in the category of financial support, the university library offers data refinement fund. So researchers can make their data shareable when they are nearly done with their corresponding article. And in addition, a data paper fund is available, which enables researchers to publish their data if no corresponding article is written. And in our study, we found that the funds currently have a minimal impact, as they do not always match researchers' needs. Researchers need to estimate the cost of research data management, which is hard to do, especially if you have not done this before. And the funds are rarely known amongst researchers of the university. There are multiple research data management guidelines on the university website. Our interviews suggest that research data management guidelines on the website have a low impact because researchers have to navigate all the web pages, which does not always go well. There's a high concentration of information with necessary jargon, which may deter researchers. And here you see an example that was mentioned in our interviews. This is a process researchers need to go through when they develop a data management plan and approach the Human Research Ethics Committee. It requires a lot of steps, and that may actually scare researchers, and maybe they just don't follow these steps then. There are several promising short-term and long-term arrangements. So let me discuss these promising arrangements, and I'll start with the short-term arrangements. So regarding policy documents, a research suggests just to start by doing. So first to install data stewards in a repository, and then to establish the policy document once the practical basics are actually all in place. Furthermore, it suggests that our study suggests that that the policy document should not be used as a coercive instrument to force researchers into proper research data management, because telling researchers what they should do creates opposition. And although researchers are expected to read policy documents, many do not. At least that's what came out of the limited number of interviews that we conducted and our own experience at the university. An arrangement to deal with this is to give data stewards or department heads the responsibility for updating researchers with the contents of these policies. And finally, if contracts with companies, for instance, survey companies, require data deletion after the research is finished, then these contracts should be renegotiated by the university. Regarding support options, we found that informal support options are preferred by researchers compared to formal options, such as using library services, and this is why the data stewards work so well. So data stewards are approachable former researchers who offer in-depth domain-specific assistance, and they are actually the first point of contact for any research data management related queries. So because these people are former researchers themselves or are still doing research, they can communicate with researchers at the same level. Regarding research data management, funders or university committees like ethics committees sometimes require data management plans to be filled in. These provide universal requests to get researchers thinking about their data management. So frequently researchers do perceive them as cumbersome and administrative, but they also do result in awareness and knowledge about research data management. So they do contribute to the desired change of mindset. Data management templates used should at least suit the general experimental workflow. So it should talk about data, it should be straightforward and simple, it should take personal data into account. Then regarding promising infrastructural arrangements. So if a seemingly institutional repository is in place, then it should be emphasized that it should mostly be used when no other better fitting repositories are available, like domain-specific ones. Data repositories should also have options for version control. So a single dataset may be edited and improved, and researchers usually cannot submit different versions of datasets and link these to each other. And also publishing data may be a requirement for peer reviews of scientific articles, but these are anonymous. So therefore it should be possible to, or usually they're anonymous, so it should be possible to publish data anonymously until the peer review period is over, and then to make it non-anonymous when the period is over. Finally, choosing the right repository for both uploading and downloading research data is still a challenge. But websites like re3data.org, like you see here, they can be used to obtain an overview of existing data repositories in different research disciplines. You can also get an overview of their main characteristics. So these are useful websites. Regarding communication, communicate through the community and peer-to-peer contact, or by educating new researchers. So newsletters are not always read. They are a less suitable alternative. Offering a central research data management course, for instance, to new researchers, young researchers, is a possibility to educate researchers both on proper research data management practices as well as the available support options. Now there are a few long-term recommendations to be made. So steps should be made towards machine actionable data management plans, so that data management plans can actually automatically process certain information and be linked to different services. So an example of this is that there's a question in the data management plan about the size of the data. So for instance, if you require storage for a data set of a certain size, there can be a message sent to the IT department, which will ensure that you have a place to store your data. Another example is that that data management plans usually contain dates. So for instance, by when certain data will be destroyed, for instance, personal data. So there should be some kind of reminder to researchers when that date is nearing. And then the researcher is reminded that he or she should either take the corresponding action to, for instance, remove that data or to update the data management plan. So this enables data management plans to become more of a service rather than just an obligation. Furthermore, ensure that researchers are aware of existing arrangements, such as data refinement funds. And finally, our studies suggest that integrating different infrastructural elements may help to improve the user experience. So an example of this is when open data portals integrate tools for processing, searching, analyzing, visualizing data, as well as make number questionable. So not currently researchers outside the open science community of the university often familiar with its role and activities. The library is not often associated with data management support by researchers, so their support options remain relatively in shadows. It's not all data stewards remain as approachable as a first point of contact, so they could refer researchers to the library.
Seems as we lost Anneke for a moment in the call. Hopefully he will be back in a minute or two. I noticed that the video was frozen, maybe 30 seconds before she just disappeared from the call. Meanwhile, I'll notice a lot of questions in Q&A, which is very well, of course. And it would be nice if some of the participants who posted the question in the Q&A would like to raise a hand and to comment briefly the Anneke presentation and maybe to elaborate in more details the question. Okay, I think Anneke is back.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Sorry, I think the connection was lost. What was the last point you heard?
For the moment, it was your picture was frozen, and we had a problem actually to hear well you in the last maybe 30 seconds or something like that. So maybe you can open your slides and.
Okay.
I think you were very close to the end, actually.
Yeah, I think it was here.
Yes, I think we saw this slide, yeah.
So I just continue from this slide, is it okay?
Yes, I think.
Okay. So I was talking about the, so the researchers outside the open science community of the university are often not familiar with the role of the open science community, and they could profit from this more. The library is often not associated with data management support, so their support options remain relatively in shadows. It's not a big problem if data stewards are actually approached to refer researchers to the library services. Data paper funds and data refinement funds do not always match researchers' needs. For instance, because research data management costs are hard to estimate, or because researchers do not want to work on data anymore of a project in which is in their experience actually already finished. Data managers can be hired for taking care of data management concerns in research projects. A drawback is that researchers simply shift the workload of research data management to others, and they may not learn proper research data management themselves. Another drawback is that researchers must know upfront that they will need a data manager in their project, or else they cannot take it into account when applying for a grant. Finally, storing lots of information on a library website does not work so well because researchers have to navigate all the pages and understand the language. So this completes our overview of infrastructural and institutional arrangements for research data sharing and use. I will emphasize that this was a pilot, this study, and we're planning to expand it to other universities so that we also get an overview of how infrastructural and institutional arrangements work in practice in other universities. So what works in which context and what doesn't. So now I arrive at the conclusions of my presentation. First we saw that the willingness and the ability of researchers to openly share their data depends a lot on the context. So our findings even suggest that the COVID-19 crisis can encourage researchers to share their data, although the poll showed something else. Second, factors influencing openly sharing research data are highly interconnected, and therefore they are difficult to unravel and to assess causality and independent and dependent factors. Generally, most researchers are positive or very positive about openly sharing research data. However, the majority of the respondents in our questionnaire disagree with the statements that they have sufficient institutional and infrastructural support to openly share their research data. The negative impact of many challenges around open sharing and using research data may be reduced with the right infrastructural and institutional arrangements, but more research in this area is needed. So our study on infrastructure and institutional arrangements is a first step, and it will be continued to investigate how universities in different countries and cultures differ in their approach towards infrastructural and institutional arrangements, and what arrangements work well under which conditions. And another question that still remains to be solved is whether infrastructural and institutional arrangements differ across research disciplines. So because of these differences, copying arrangements that work well in one university or research institution may not always have the expected effects in another institution. So this is worth investigating. So it was a privilege to present some of my research on these topics to you today. Thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to answer any question you may have.
Thank you, Anneke. Thank you very much for your presentation. We have already 5 questions in the Q&A.
Okay.
And firstly, I'm wondering whether someone of the participants who posted the questions here would like to raise the hand, maybe to give the right to speak, to briefly, let's say, comment your presentation and elaborate question, his or her question. For instance, Charles Oppenheim or Manuel Alejandro or Jerome. Yeah, Charles would like to talk. Okay. Charles, can you try to unmute yourself?
Can you hear me?
Yes, very well.
Okay, thank you for a very interesting presentation. My interest is in intellectual property rights and data protection. A barrier to possible data sharing may well be questions about the ownership of that data. That data may well be owned by the researcher, by their employer, by a third party, possibly by a journal publisher or some other publisher. And so that will be a factor in deterring the sharing of data. And also, if the data includes personal data, then data protection legislation will inhibit the sharing of it. And I just wonder how much research you have carried out into those factors and how important you think they are.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you, and very good questions indeed. So IPR, I think it differs a lot per faculty, at least in my university. So in my own faculty, this doesn't play a huge role, but there are some faculties where this is more important. So I'm mainly more on the social science side or social technical side. But I believe that in some disciplines, more in the natural sciences, this can be, especially for research that is funded by industries, the IPR issues may play a very important role. So I think that it's also important to explain to researchers what they can actually do about this. So sometimes it is said, okay, so there are contracts we have with industry, so there's nothing we can do. We do see that there's a change in the willingness also of companies, but also other stakeholders who collaborate with researchers in the university to become more open to openly share some of the data. It's not always the major part of it, but some important findings can be shared. Also, sometimes when, for instance, a PhD researcher is starting the research, there are negotiations about what can actually become openly available or not, because there's a conflict here, because in the university, all the data that PhD students collect has to become open, unless there are, of course, privacy issues or other issues. But if some other conditions do not allow for this, there's of course a conflict. So there's discussion going on, and it's very important to inform researchers about what these conflicts are and what they can actually do about it. You also touched upon privacy issues. Indeed, there's personal data. At the same time, there's often still part of the data set that can still be shared. For instance, you can anonymize the data set, at least to a certain extent. Or sometimes people say, well, I've done interviews, so I'm not able to openly share it because it's too sensitive. But usually when you do interviews, you're coding your data. There's a code book you could share. So you can think of what other parts of your research you could share that could still enable other researchers to build upon your research. And what I think is important is to change this mindset of, well, it's not possible at all, into what would be possible. So to think about that. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, yes.
Okay, Charles, thank you very much for joining the discussion and for your question. And thank you for Anneke for the response on the question. So I think maybe we can select one more question to answer alive. Then, Anneke, if you have more time and energy, you can try to, in textual mode, answer on some question after your presentation, of course. For instance, I noticed there are two questions from Jeren, I think.
Yeah.
Jeren, would you like maybe to speak or just to read your question and to? So Jeren, if you would like to speak, just raise your hand. There should be the option in Zoom for that. I'm not sure, do you have, microphone and other equipment needed for speaking?
I could also respond directly. So Jeroen is asking the question, why was the open science community considered a questionable arrangement? Because of the nature or the unclarity? It's not because of the nature. So the open science community is actually seen as a very useful initiative by the researchers who are taking part of it. So they believe that they are learning from each other. I also see that I'm also part of that community, by the way. I see that there are useful activities shared with other researchers and also with people who are working on the institutional infrastructural support to learn from each other. So why it was a questionable arrangement is because this is barely known by researchers who are not part of that community. So there's a website where all the people who are part of the community are actually mentioned, and they're what they want to do for the community, but researchers outside of that community are not looking for their website. They may not even know that it exists, and they do not know that they can actually approach people who are working in the, or who are taking part of the open science community to be supported, to better understand how they can actually manage their research data. So that's why it was a questionable arrangement.
Okay. Also, there is one more question from Jeren with much more number of likes. So on top of the list.
Right. Oh, okay. Thank you. Did you look into the supervisors' attitudes and any further, like relations between those that stimulated open sharing and country discipline, institute and age? No, unfortunately not. But I think this would be a very useful area to examine in our future research. So the study of Timon that I mentioned, that I was explaining in the second part of the presentation, is not finished yet. It actually just started. And I think this would be one group of people to involve in the interviews, like what would supervisors think they could do to enhance research data sharing and use, and would they actually be willing to take the role that I mentioned, where they could be responsible for informing researchers in their research group about the policies that the university has in place. So it would be good to look into that and actually to see whether these supervisors would take up that role that we mentioned. Thanks for the questions.
Okay, Anneke, thank you very much. I would like that we have more time to discuss, because we have a few more questions here in the Q&A box. But unfortunately, we are at the end of this session, and we have, I believe we have to make a short break before the next keynote speaker, Professor Zuren Auer. So I will complete here the session. If you want, you can stay in the call, and maybe you can type the answers on those questions, of course. I would like once again to thank you, of course, for joining us today and for your really nice presentation, especially taking into account your, let's say, health situation. You said that you have some problem with the last few days. So thank you very, very much for being with us today and for giving your talk alive, let's say, in this virtual environment.
Thank you, and thank you for the questions and the attention.